Waking up is available at any moment in any situation. Psychological circumstances don't really matter all that much. The right moment with the right question, the right pointer, the right circumstance, you can wake up in a heartbeat. And that can have a powerful impact for the rest of your life. No question about it. It's the integration process, the embodiment process, the living from that moment to moment. That's a lifetime work and often requires psychological assistance. We have all kinds of stuff that we were handed at a certain point in our life and said, here's your karmic bundle. This is what you got to work with. Now you have the rest of your life to do it.
Hi, I'm Ricky DeRiz. Welcome to episode 69 of the Mind That Ego podcast. Stephan Bodian is a psychotherapist, spiritual teacher, and pioneer in the integration of non-duality in Western psychology. He leads an annual spiritual transformation program, the School of Awakening, and is the author of several books, including Meditation for Dummies and Wake Up Now. Following our last interview 5 years ago, Stephan returns to discuss the themes in his latest book, Infinite Awakening, A Guide to Non-Dual Wisdom and the Pathless Path. We explore the difference between direct and progressive paths, the risk of trying to be mindful, why sudden awakening requires lifelong integration, trauma work in the context of non-duality, psychological pathways from IFS to Jung, and the necessity of an open heart and awakened ego. We address misconceptions about emptiness and detachment, love's essential role in the yoga of relationships, Buddhist non-attachment versus attachment theory, and the taboo of sexuality. What is the Pathless Path?
Yeah, the Pathless Path, which happened to be part of the title of my book, and it kind of came as an afterthought. But I started, thinking about the title and how to frame the intro. And the Pathless Path can have many different layers of understanding, shall we say. I mean, one level is Pathless Path because there's nowhere to go. There's no path. It's right here, right now, always available. All you need to do is turn your attention back upon yourself to discover your true nature as awareness. And there's no distance between you and what you're looking for. So that's one understanding of the Pathless Path. Another, which is a little richer, you could say, is that each of us is the path, So there's no prescribed path for all of us to follow. There is only our own unique path, which unfolds through our heart and through our inner knowing, our inner intuition, right? Mm-hmm. And so we need to, as I emphasize throughout the book, follow our own inner guidance. First of all, find how to consult that, get in touch with that, and then to make that the point is to follow the path that your heart leads you on, the pathless path, because it's not prescribed, Doesn't have a title, doesn't have a fixed destination, But and I was thinking about it recently. You asked that. You said you were going to ask that question, and there's a third understanding, I would say, of the pathless path, which is that not all paths lead to the same place as the pathless path. There are many different paths that lead many different places. And you had expressed an interest in perhaps touching on Jungian psychology. That's a path unto itself. Mm-hmm. The work that he does, the way he followed his own path, again, the pathless path, his own unique path, following his inner guidance, the visions and the imaginations that he had and his writings and things like that. That was his path. And that's recommended within the Jungian tradition, a path of individuation, which is unique to each individual. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the other dimension. I don't claim that the path I'm offering is called Non-Dual Wisdom and the Pathless Path, the subtitle. I don't claim that's the only path or the only, valuable path or beneficial path. There are many different paths. And I bow to all the different paths, right? Mm-hmm. So that's my understanding, the broadest understanding for me of the pathless path,
Thanks for covering that and also bringing up the Jungian approach. And it's something I absolutely love, and I'll just show this early on, just show the physical copy. I loved reading the book. I loved our last conversation. I loved the full circle as well, the fact that I think I mentioned last time, Meditation for Dummies was the first ever book I had on meditation when I was probably 17. It was, good 20 years ago. And actually, slight tangent, but I was reading this recently. I was outside, it was a sunny day, and some guy actually said, "Oh, what are you reading?" And he was drawn to the front cover. So I started to speak about you and this interview. And he had no meditation background, but something in him, I felt like I was witness to the beginning of his path in that sense through this book as some kind of resonance. I wanted to just share that.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah.
As context.
Yeah, it's amazing how, a book probably gives off a vibration
Yeah.
that people can sense, and certain words
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. And the visual as well it pulls you
Good.
in.
I'm glad that was my choice. I really like that swath.
Yeah, it's cool. Nice color scheme. But yeah, so, for me, there's this really, like, personally, this strong interest in both within the non-dual awakening side of the progressive path and the direct path. So that's like one aspect of what you're talking to. And then the psychological, the psycho-spiritual, however it is defined. Could you maybe say more about those distinctions, firstly with the progressive versus the direct path in non-duality?
Sure. Again, I make this distinction also in my other book, Beyond Mindfulness, and quite a bit in the new book as well. I'm a great lover of mindfulness meditation, I want to begin by saying, and I really recommend it to many people. I think it's a beautiful practice. In terms of awakening, however, it poses certain problems for those whose goal is, aspiration is, to awaken. One of which is that, first of all, you're taught that you have to do mindfulness. You have to, make a certain effort to be mindful all the time. And, that's what you're taught to practice. You're mindful on your cushion or chair when you're meditating. In everyday life, you have to be mindful, make an effort to be mindful. But from the direct approach that I teach, being mindful, so-called, being aware, is our natural state. We're always aware. Awareness is always happening. And as soon as you start efforting to be aware, efforting to be mindful, you're adding another head on top of your own, as they say in Zen, which I think was the original meaning of that statement. It's a common phrase in Zen. Don't add another head on top of your own. And in fact, one Zen teacher was commenting on mindfulness. He said, "Don't be mindful, please." Please don't be mindful. Yeah. I get it. Don't be mindful. Just relax, open, let awareness happen all by itself. So that's one of the issues. The other is that in that doing, you're perpetuating the sense of a meditator, a separate meditator who has to always be present in order to do mindfulness. And the whole point of awakening is to relax and let go of the meditator. In fact, when I first met Jean Klein, I was really struck when he said, the only reason to meditate is to discover the meditator. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, don't get in the habit of meditating, Mm-hmm. So, the point is to discover the meditator, not to actively become the meditator, And of course, the third thing that it does is give you a sense of that, like the progressive approach, as we were talking about, there's someplace to go. You need to go off on a journey, cultivating certain qualities. Sorry about the plane. Helicopter. You have to go on a journey of cultivating certain qualities and becoming a different person. And that's not the point. See, from the direct approach, is to discover who you really are and let that knowing transfuse your being and transform you from the inside, not trying to change yourself step by step or according to some predetermined path. Again, the determined path, not the pathless path. So those are the pitfalls of progressive approach. Huh? And direct approach, on the other hand, points directly, as its name implies. Constant pointing, using inquiry, using statements, pointers, words that remind us to turn around and discover who's looking. Right?
What I really respect about your work is that you hold that truth but you also address all the ways, many of the ways in which the complexity of the mind can interfere, but also addressing this issue that awakening, direct awakening to awareness, to the non-dual, doesn't equate sudden enlightenment or sudden psychological, emotional transformation. How do you view that relationship between the awakening and that realization of your true nature versus more of a transformation, and you could say individuation, but something that, affects the personality, habitual patterns of thought and emotion? How do you see that relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really want to emphasize that this book is a lot about that. There's quite a bit of awakening material in here, guided meditations, pointers throughout the book, inquiry questions, all kinds of great stuff. But a lot of the book, based on my work and discoveries as a psychotherapist and a psychological person, a human being, the hard way, that I felt I had a lot to offer. And that was one of the reasons I felt the book was important and unique. There are a lot of wonderful teachers out there and teachings and things. But so, yeah, that whole issue, I think that waking up is available at any moment in any situation. Psychological circumstances don't really matter all that much. If you, on the right moment, with the right question, the right pointer, the right circumstance, you can wake up in a heartbeat and discover who you really are, your essential nature as consciousness, as awareness, and that can have a powerful impact for the rest of your life. No question about it. It may fade into the background. Once you really see it clearly, it'll always be there somehow, and you can reconnect with it. That's my experience with myself and working with many, many people over the years. It's the integration process, the embodiment process, the living from that moment to moment. That's a lifetime work and often requires psychological assistance, psychological support, because we come in with what I call the karmic bundle. We each have a karmic bundle, right? We've got our body and mind. We've got our conditioning from the past. We have trauma we've experienced. We've got the limitations and gifts we've received as part of our, genetic inheritance. We have all kinds of stuff that we were handed at a certain point in our life and said, here's your karmic bundle. This is what you got to work with. Now you have the rest of your life to do it. Right? Some people call this waking up and growing up. I talk about the karmic bundle. But I think, so you can go from awakening and basically you step right back into the karmic bundle, into the body mind, which has been programmed in certain ways, conditioned in certain ways. And, and you're going to start reacting and acting the same old way unless you start bringing the awareness that you've awakened to deliberately somehow, consciously somehow, in an aware way somehow, into everyday life situations, so that you pause and reflect and step back and be aware of your true nature, your deeper nature, and let yourself see from that place. Be aware of life and other people and circumstances from that deeper knowing. See, unless you do that deliberately, most of the time you're going to fall back into the old patterns. It was a standing joke when I was a Zen student, a Zen monk for many years. You'd have a long retreat and, you'd have blissful, powerful experiences. And then you leave retreat and go back home and immediately you start yelling at your kids.
Yeah.
That's a standing joke, I think probably in the Vipassana tradition too, It inevitably happens unless you are consciously willing to engage in the process of integration and embodiment, what I call embodiment, bringing it into the body-mind in a lived way, moment-to-moment way. So in that realm, I think psychological work, psychotherapy of various kinds, can be very powerful because it can help, one way to see it, an old metaphor that's used throughout the Buddhist tradition, sun and clouds, right? The sun of your true nature is always shining. It's covered by clouds much of the time. How do you dispel the clouds? One way is that you rest and reside and abide as the sun of your true nature. And little by little, that sun will burn off the clouds. That works.
Mm-hmm.
Takes a long time. The other way is to get out there and start dissipating the clouds actively, to help reveal the sun. So from this metaphor, psychological work is clearing away the clouds. You're dissipating the clouds as much as you can through releasing them, in some way or other, through some kind of psychotherapeutic inquiry or technique that, the clouds are no longer there. That old belief that you had that colored everything you see in life and how you react with other people. I'm not good enough. There's something wrong with me. The world is a dangerous place. Those things. When those dissipate, wow, you're suddenly a freer person and not as reactive. So that can work really powerfully. And I've done kinds of psychotherapy. Still, I don't really do psychotherapy anymore. EMDR, for example, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing. I think IFS is a powerful technique as well for revealing these different parts and, releasing what's at their heart, at their core. So there are some very wonderful techniques now that are available. And I think okay. Yeah, maybe I'll let you ask your next question. There's more I could say, of course, but we'll keep talking.
Yeah, because I definitely want us to, because you kind of touched upon it, I want us to go more into the nature of trauma. That's one of, for me, the outstanding parts of the book is the way that you describe it so crucially embedded in the non-dual. And I think this is part of the issue for someone like me. You mentioned complex trauma and the impact that has on awakening. And that bridge is so essential because on one hand, I've had this sense at times in the non-dual space, I almost have felt, because of my traumas and just what I've struggled with, that there's this, not necessarily an equal footing in those spaces. So if talking of awakening and returning to your true nature is going to be different for someone with complex trauma. And I find in my experience, there's almost struggling to find the word, not equality. There's another word for that. We don't necessarily have the same starting point in that field. And maybe for some people.
Yeah. I mean, starting out with a certain deficit, a certain deficiency or lack or, a certain handicap in the sense that it's used in golf or, some other sport. There's a handicap. You're behind from the beginning in a certain way and it's harder to catch up. So, absolutely. And I think trauma is a unique case. By the way, to those who might want to have a look at the book, go first to the trauma chapter, especially if you've had trauma. I think you'll find it very revealing and helpful. If you're going to read anything, read the trauma chapter. And on my Substack site, that's still available to read. So, there's a lot to say about trauma. Like you, I have complex trauma. My early life was one traumatic event after another. Even going back to infancy. So it goes deep into the body. Some of it's was never experienced in a conscious way at all, in a cognitive way at all. So it's deep in the body. I've had to work with this for years. Only in the last 10 or 15 years have I realized, wow, that was actually trauma that I experienced. We've started to understand these things. And that's why I'm reacting, it was like been a revelation last 15, 20 years, which is, giving me a tremendous amount of compassion for myself and for others, especially for myself, always feeling like, gee, how come I didn't get that? Or how come and yet I was able to have a profound awakening when I was with Jung 30 some years ago. But and a really transformative awakening. But over time, still, it was difficult to, how come I keep going into fear again and again? It's like, what's wrong with me? Well, trauma, folks. Deep trauma. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also this sun and cloud metaphor in the Jungian sense and IFS and Jungian sense. So a Jungian complex or a part in IFS, this idea of like an exiled part. They're clouds, but they also are clouds with a gravitational pull. And they
And the
pull you
clouds
in.
need to also to be loved and honored.
And that, yeah.
From an IFS point of view.
Yeah.
So-called clouds, IFS wouldn't call them clouds, see. The clouds and this is something we want to talk about the paradigm that's underneath these different approaches. You see, because the paradigm under the non-dual approaches of the East primarily is that these clouds are to be dispelled and released. In the Tibetan tradition, they talk about spontaneous release. Emotions naturally self-liberate is the word.
Yeah.
But behind that statement is the idea is that emotions are supposed to liberate. Why? You see, from a Jungian point of view, maybe, I'm not going along with this necessarily, but from a Jungian point of view, these may lead to deeper realizations. They may lead to the unconscious and to archetypes that need to be honored. And there's a whole nother way of looking at the content of awareness, the content of the psyche. Yeah. That fundamental difference is really important. I think it's a very strong dividing line between these traditions. See, from a non-dual perspective, you can do IFS, for example, and simply see it as a way to release or love these parts into relaxing and allowing true nature to come to the fore more and more. So we're not, trying to get rid of them. We're allowing them to be there, but we're not putting much attention to them or emphasis on them. We're not looking for their deeper meaning. I mean, you do look at the history of it and you to try to understand its nature as a separate part or being unto itself. But you don't want to find deeper meaning there. You just oh, it's nice to have this part and this part. We're all on good terms. We love one another. And then we can move from our essential nature as consciousness. It's not the same as how do I engage all these different parts and elaborate on them and, do free association with them and dream about them and all that. So these are different paths. Again, pathless paths. I think these are different paths.
Yeah, it also makes me think of the difference. You do touch upon this in the book as well. The very nature of liberation traditions, then they're not designed to engage with thought stuff or parts or psychological content.
Exactly.
And that does, especially in our Western frame of mind, it means we can potentially overlook the complexity. And that's more of a observation and release, as you say, let things arise.
Yeah, arise in awareness, as you say. And when they self-liberate in awareness, which is not caught by them, identified with them.
Yeah, like the Buddhist non-attachment, right? This observe, don't become
entangled. The Buddhists have really, elaborated on this at great length, and they have some wonderful techniques for doing this, in many different traditions. So it's a really coherent and cohesive tradition. Jungian psychology, on the other hand, this is what I was thinking about in my talk. I'm going to talk with someone in a few days about this on my own podcast, is that there is really no praxis. There's no practice. There's no clear-cut practice. Mm-hmm. You can't really do Jungian psychology the way you can do Buddhism.
It's true. Yeah, I feel like the more I experience it, I feel, obviously we associate the Jungian terminology so strongly with that domain of the psyche, but it's almost the difference between soul and spirit in that it's the language of the soul, that archetypal, mythological, right. And that's an ongoing process forever, right? The individuating.
It's an process forever. I would say exactly that. And that's one of the pitfalls.
Yeah. Well, especially if you look for an end point, or I will become fully individuated, or I will be fully healed, or I'll be whatever it may be. I wanted to note as well that observation versus in IFS and in a Jungian approach as well. There's more of a dialogue with the clouds or with the content. It feels like there's a way that does fit with this idea of welcoming and openness to experience. Could you maybe talk talk a bit to that as
No,
well.
I think that's absolutely within the context of the book. And there's a chapter called Welcoming What Is, which Ricky's referring to. In the context of welcoming, absolutely, you can learn more about these parts, these energies, talk with them, find out their history, all those things, and really love them in a wholehearted way. But still, underneath it all, the motive is to let them, to let them go and be as they are. Liberate doesn't necessarily mean get rid of them, but it also means they're not constantly demanding attention either, right?
Yeah.
They have their own place, So I don't want to give the impression, particularly some Buddhist traditions would say you're really purifying, more or less. You're trying to get rid of all this. Theravada Buddhism, more or less, you're trying to do that. You're not trying to love it. You're trying to release it, get rid of it, so you can, exist in a kind of nirvana state, free of all of that. That's not Mahayana Buddhism. You get into Mahayana Buddhism, that split is not there. It's non-dual. It's all embraced, but with a certain this kind of attitude toward it, right? We're not going to indulge it. But I think the more non-dual we can be, for me, non-dual means, the way I like to put it, people often chuckle when I say this, nothing left out. Non-dual means nothing left out. If it's truly non-dual, nothing's left out.
Yeah.
How do you leave out anything? So you're embracing everything. You're welcoming everything to be as it is. And in my own experience, post-awakening and over the years, more and more, the different parts of me are just kind of acting on their own and having their own, say, and it's all beautiful. And there's no problem with it. But there's no one in charge. There's no one part and no one in charge of it all.
Yeah. It also makes me think of the importance of, again, just referring to IFS and Jung. IFS will mention blending with a part, and Jung will say complex possession, which both imply those parts take over your system. And the non-dual, the freedom of that is to allow them, and they lose their tenacity. It's been my experience with it as well. So much value through IFS, particularly IFS therapy. It's been probably the most beneficial healing work that I've done with my therapist, and it's been immensely helpful. And like you say, they're still there, but they lose that charge and that tone. And the point of harmonizing the inner system, and it does feed back to the awakening, right? Because if you're not being blended with all these different aspects of the self.
And by blending, you mean, I think it's important to clarify what you mean by that. You mean you kind of become identified with it. You don't have any sense of your own separation as a person.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
You get it possesses you, like you said, with the Jungian. You're possessed by the part.
Yeah.
Which has happened like an inner child that's just so demanding that it won't let you go, and starts acting out to other people from this child part. An example. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's often the reactivity, is that part, that complex is taking control of the conscious mind, which does lead me to the ego. And how you view the relationship to ego in relation to what we're talking to, I think that's super interesting, in this kind of multiplicity of the self, and also to non-duality. Because I know we spoke about this last time, but I think feels like the terrain is
well, I've clarified some of in writing the book, there's a lot of like, what do I really mean? I've been teaching this stuff. What do I really mean? Now I've got to write it down. I had to do a lot of thinking, really deep consideration on some of these topics. So in terms of these different parts, I mean, there is, we are talking about loving them, and welcoming them in what they are, and what is doing the welcoming. I would say that's probably more like ego. In the best sense of ego. In IFS, it's called self, but again, what do they mean by self? It's obviously not the self that we mean within Advaita, or true self within Zen or something like that. But it's we couldn't function without ego. I have a very interesting quote from a Theravada monk, a Vipassana monk, in the book, who says, of course we need ego. You couldn't practice Buddhism. You couldn't meditate. You couldn't, have a path at all if you didn't have an ego. Ego, from the Western psychological point of view, is the function that mediates between inside and outside, between our essential drives, to eat, to mate, and the outside world. We need the ego to do that. Without that, schizophrenics often don't have an ego. They can't function. So you need that ego. My point in the book, just my way of looking at it, kind of a creative way to look at it, is that ego, we never get rid of ego. There's always an ego coordinating between inner and outer, self and other in a certain way, but that ego needs to be educated. Ego needs to be awakened. Mm-hmm. Ego needs to realize that instead of what it thought its job was, which is to aggrandize and feed and be the agent of the self, which is inside, which is what Jung would say. See, Jung would say there's a deep self inside, and ego is like a reflection of self, right? As I recall it, like a mirror image of self, which functions in the world. That's the Jungian position. Here, I would say, ego needs to know that there is no self. And how does ego function when it realizes there's no self? See, I think we can have an ego function and realize that there's no self.
That's such a good point. So I wrote this essay on spiritual psychosis, and I also find that issue of I've had this brand mind, that ego, for close to 9 years without being able to fully articulate.
I forgot about it.
No, I still don't even know how to describe this thing, but in this article, and it was for the sake of the point I was making, was similar to what you were saying. It was a mediator of perception as well, and divine perception, but it's based around an R.D. Laing quote where he says, I'll paraphrase, but he says, true sanity basically requires the ego to be in service to the divine and not its betrayer.
Beautiful. I think that's great. I go with R.D. Laing.
Yeah, and this reorientation, and as you describe it, I was trying to explain it as almost like its role in awakening is to become like fully functional and fully transparent at the same time. It's like a paradox.
Beautiful.
There's something in that
too. I think that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
we both framed it well.
Yeah. And it's interesting actually as well. Jung, I think initially was going to call it the ego complex, or he did see it similar to a complex.
Call what? The ego complex?
Rather than just the ego as separate, it was an ego complex, which kind of does fit more of this idea of the construct of the self. There is, because you mentioned in the book quite a few different approaches. There's or perspective like Metzinger's ego tunnel, right, and Bergenthal's self and world construct system.
That's a nice phrase, isn't it?
It's
self and world construct. Yeah. We have somehow constructed a world around which a so-called separate self is built, or is built around this separate self. That self and world construct, he, as an existential psychotherapist, sees that it's just a construct. He doesn't take it to be necessarily real. He believes you'd have to have some self and world construct. You couldn't operate without one. Same with Metzinger, who says, again, it's a kind of construct. Ego, world, is something that appears in consciousness, but they would say you need it to function. Is that necessarily the case? Western point of view, certainly. Eastern point of view, can you function without, a self and world construct system? Again, I don't think you can really function without an ego, but I think that's different from the construct, the dream that we create around an illusion of a separate self. And an ego is free of that illusion. An enlightened ego, awakened ego.
Yeah, and similar to what we were saying with parts or with complexes, there's the awareness of it, but not the attachment to it, or seeing the ego as your identity, seeing through it as
I like
a very
transparent. I like the way you put that.
That transparency. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really proud of myself for that one. Stephen likes my metaphor. This is great.
Yeah, no, it's really I'll use it, Ricky.
Please do, yeah. Please cite me, Ricky DeRiz.
Yeah, I'll cite you the first time, and probably after that I won't.
Just forget, yeah. I'll let my ego get out of the way in this. I do want it, because you mentioned this as well, like with the link between this self and world construct, and you do have a section of the book around deconstructing the dream.
Right.
What do you mean by the dream, and how do you work to deconstruct
Well, the dream is like what we've been talking about. And I think as your awakening deepens and you embody it more and more, you integrate it more and more, you see how almost all the time we're living in some dream or other, which we construct moment after moment, is I'm here, the world's out there, the world is threatening, abundant and offering, a scary place, an attractive place, or whatever. And this is what's true about the world around me. And we're constantly constructing these dreams. And they're just dreams. And some of them are so subtle that we don't see them. So over time, and I think this is one of the reasons I talk about infinite awakening in the book. I think we're infinitely, it was originally called Endless Awakening, and that title apparently had been used. So they suggested infinite awakening, which I think is fine. So infinite awakening is endless. We're constantly awakening out of yet another dream, because the mind is a dream weaver, a dream maker, constantly making more dreams. So we're constantly seeing through the dream, coming back to reality, right? And so the dream is basically, there's a me here, there are others there, there's a world out there, that's the dream. In reality, that's just a projection, folks. And so what's intrinsically real right now in this moment, always, it forces us to come back again and again to this, just this right now, which is where the joy is, where the happiness is, where the peace is. Any dream, it's got its price.
It's like entering, resting in the truth of pure subjectivity.
Pure non-duality.
Pure non-duality, yeah, which is only ever experienced and not objectified. I'm tempted to go more into the kind of granular of subject and object, which I know it might be more technical for certain people. Maybe we can see if we go there, but
whatever you'd like.
It was something that's present. I really want to note it as really important and recurring in the book is, let's say we awaken from the dream to some extent, and there is a thinning out of experience in some way. You begin to notice the more subtle aspects of experience. And often that can be, rather than I am the body and I am the mind, you can start to sense more energetically. And I know that there is a distinction between the energetic and the non-dual. I spoke to Judith Blackstone about this as well. That was an interesting nuance around that. But you do refer to the chakras quite a lot. And you do note the opening of different centers. And I thought that was a really important framing. Could you talk to, because I think this is something that is useful for a lot of people, in the sense that you note how some people can almost have an awakening in the higher chakras, but then the heart and below can remain closed. Could you maybe talk to that?
Yeah, no, I think you've said it, really. I think people tend to open in the upper chakras first. That's called the crown chakra. I actually only talk about the chakras once in the book, in that one section on awakening. But, there's the opening in the crown chakra often. It's like, the energy goes out and there's just like, wow, infinite, global, all expansive, boundaryless reality. Beautiful, very subtle level as well. And then, you're down through the third eye chakra, the throat chakra, and then into the heart chakra. Very often for many people, for a long time, the awakening never really reaches the heart. And the opening of the heart is a big, important step. I remember that happened to me, after awakening, for sure. It happened to me actually when I was studying Mahamudra, I remember, and it was just like, oh my God, the boundless love and the sense of interconnectedness with all beings suddenly opened up, and it was like, whoa, where was it? Where was I? What was I thinking? And then it can extend down into the chakras that are fed in a certain way by the heart, which the power chakra, the interpersonal chakra, the survival chakra, all these deeper issues, right, can become awakened as well. Takes much longer, usually, for that to happen. It's interesting how it goes up and then it comes back down again. Embodying.
Yeah, super important. I think as well, like this has been true to my experience and also just observation of people in this field, in that if those higher energy centers are open and awakened, there can be a lot of equanimity, there can be a lot of insight, but there can be a certain coldness.
A detachment.
Yeah, in a way, and not in like a complimentary way, but
Right.
almost like the losing touch with your humanity and losing touch with, like you say, that love and compassion. And I think it's really, I almost want us to expand out from that point of the heart and love, because it is so important, the realization of that heart openness, because sometimes, especially non-duality and the way it is taught in some ways, it can feel a little lacking in love and compassion. And I feel right?
It's about awakening and awareness, and these are all, subtle level experiences, but do they translate into, compassion? I remember when I was a Zen monk, one of my fellow monks mentioned something about love, and I looked at him very seriously and said, "What does Zen have to do with love?" Really, I actually said that.
Yeah.
I'm amazed. So what does Zen have to do with love? It's one way to look.
Yeah.
One perspective. Has everything to do with love, of course. But, love is not talked about in Zen, pretty much.
Well, this idea is like from that space of this idea of emptiness and form. And I think you mentioned this also in the trauma section, where there can be a conflation between like emptiness in the sense of emptiness and form. Like form is emptiness, emptiness is form, versus more of a void, abyss kind of feeling.
It's a misunderstanding of the word emptiness.
Right, yeah.
It's emptiness. I don't think the original has that connotation of like an empty vessel, an empty bowl, an empty head, an empty heart. It doesn't have those connotations. The word shunyata, or shunyata, however it's pronounced, apparently is related etymologically to the word swell. So there's a sense of empty fullness, expansiveness that you don't get. And if you really explore emptiness, you'll find that emptiness is just another word for beingness. It's just the essential nature of being is to be empty of substantiality, solidity. There's no solidity there. It's another way of saying impermanence. Yeah. It's the Mahayana way of saying impermanence. It adds another dimension to impermanence. Like Thich Nhat Hanh would say, you can't, you can't, what is it? The vase is already broken. He said, the jar is already broken, because that's its, natural denouement. It's going to eventually break. It's already contained within it, its own impermanence, its own dissolution. So everything is insubstantial. Can't hold on to it. That's really what emptiness means.
And the nature, and it can be a loaded term, but the nature of unconditional love as part of being, rather than, and I'll lead this into another point of inquiry, in that love that is as the nature of our being, versus this more like M. Scott Peck approach of enacting love as action.
Right.
Could you talk to that in terms of relationship, how we relate to the world, and particularly how we relate to other people?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter for those listening on relationships, awakening relationships. But obviously, the love we experience for another is one expression of the greater love that we are, right? Translated through the heart into intimate relationship, huh? Now, of course, we potentially can have that love and act that love with all beings, and this would be called bodhicitta from the Tibetan point of view, unconditional love, the love, awakened love. Bodhicitta means awakened heart, right? So to be able to bring that into every moment of life, that's it. The translation, the transmutation, the embodiment that we're talking about. But I think most important is that we recognize our true nature as love. Once we awaken to that, once we realize that in our own hearts, it naturally will move through our life, and then we see how that flows, how that functions. And of course, on the other side is that intimate relationships can draw that forth from us, and that's one of the great benefits or beauties of an intimate relationship, is that we get an opportunity to love another person and to be loved by them. That flow of love can awaken us to the deeper heart. Mm. So that's beautiful. We don't want to forget that. Intimate relationships have a function, several functions. One is to provide us a mirror for all our stuck places and patterns, but the other is to ignite the flow of love in our own hearts, right? And with other people.
Yeah, it's beautifully put. The yoga of relationships.
The yoga of relationships, yeah. What a gift.
Yeah.
We can't live without them, we're biologically determined to want other people.
Yeah.
In certain ways, and that draws out the love. So, we can resist it. Some people, maybe many people do, but, in the normal course of a human life, we're drawn into intimate relationship, both sexual and non-sexual, close friendships, etc., loved ones in the family.
And I definitely want to move on to Eros. I know we want to discuss that, but briefly before, could you address because the terminology is misleading because it seems to be in the same field, but they have very different meanings, and that is non-attachment in a Buddhist sense,
right,
and attachment theory. Could you talk to that dynamic, how you see that?
Yeah, it was interesting. I had actually written about this 10 years ago or 15 years ago and then I put it in the book because it had already been written. But in the Western psychological traditions in the last 20 years or so, the notion of attachment, healthy versus unhealthy or secure versus insecure attachment, has been an area of great inquiry and investigation. And so what seems to have been discovered, in terms of how we categorize these things, is that people who grew up with parents who were loving, consistently loving and supportive, provided a healthy support system, and were consistently there for their child, create what's called secure attachment in the child and the subsequent adult. You feel secure that other people are there, that they're loving, that they're kind. You can count on them if you need to. You trust other people, not everyone, of course, but those who are close to you, who have proven themselves. You feel trust and you feel secure in that. It's not a source of anxiety or concern, right? And when you get into a relationship, you tend to bond easily and in a secure way, and the relationships tend to be stable. Okay, with insecure attachment, which is at least 40% of most people in the United States, according to studies, mm-hmm. Whatever reason, we didn't get it. Okay, there's insecure attachment of various kinds, avoidant attachment. If you were treated with indifference, or, parents who weren't really there for you, who were more aloof and distant, detached. You'll be an avoidant attachment person. You don't want to get involved. You don't want to get too involved. Someone gets too close to you, you feel they're clingy and you push them away. This is very common, I think, especially among men, but, common among both sexes. Then there's insecure, what's the other one? I forget these sometimes. Anxious avoidant.
Yeah.
And I think anxious avoidant, which
disorganized.
Then there's disorganized. And then there's disorganized, really. So anxious avoidant, or just anxious attachment, is you're just not sure of the other person. You're not sure where they stand. You're constantly anxious. Do they really love me? Do they not love me? Are they there for me? Are they going to leave me? This kind of thing, very common, probably one of the most common. And then disorganized attachment is people who grew up in abusive and chaotic households who just don't trust relationship at all, and are confused, really, and often overwhelmed by intimate relationships. Those are pretty rough explanations, but those are the four that we would say. 1, secure; 3, insecure. Other people divide them in different ways, but that's primarily. And as we listen, perhaps, the viewers, listeners will immediately think, oh, now I'm that one. I think we probably have a good sense of where we stand, and that governs our behavior in intimate relationships. What's interesting is that people with secure attachments are much less likely to get attached from the Buddhist point of view. Because attachment from the Buddhist point of view is not just about people. It's about being attached to the way things are, or the way things we want things to be, and being very disturbed and upset and threatened when things aren't that way. And that's what causes suffering from the Buddhist point of view, is attachment. Attachment to having the world be a certain way, when in fact, as we said, it's impermanent, it's empty, it's constantly changing. Attachment's inevitably going to lead to suffering because nothing remains the same, right? So from that point of view, that kind of attachment is often based on insecure attachment. If you are securely attached, you trust life. You don't have to worry about whether it's going to change. You trust that change will be okay. It'll be beneficent. It'll be neutral. It'll be okay. Everything's going to work out okay. So you're not so tightly attached. If you grow up with an insecure attachment, you're going to be much more attached from a Buddhist point of view. So there's an irony to that. And of course, the words are used in different ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the relationship. I think, because you mentioned John Wellwood a few times in the book as well, I think if it was an essay, it was part of one of his books where he said that a lot of people with anxious attachment are drawn to the Buddhist teaching of non-attachment, but it's through like a maladaptive, it's trying to escape, right? Escape that fear, escape that fear of loss.
Exactly. Of another angle to look at that.
Yeah. And that's one paradox in it. And as well, this paradox of the more that you connect to your being as fundamentally loving and compassionate, the less you need. And I'm not conflating like healthy needs with you need it from an attached perspective, love from someone else. And that's another paradox in a similar vein of, you can love more. So you're free to love more through that realization in relationship. I want to, so moving on to, in the nature of relationships and love, you talk about Eros, and it was really good to see this in the context of non-duality. I don't see so many people talking, if anyone, really talking to this. And it's very much an exploration I'm in currently in terms of what that means, connection to that energy archetypally, but then in relationship, also how, we were talking earlier about the gravitational force. Sexuality, for most people, has a gravitational force. It's something that the shadow of, and just to be clear, I'm not conflating all Eros with sexuality, and maybe that's something we can define, but the shadow of unacknowledged sexual attraction can play out as abuse in power dynamics. it can also be the biggest source of attachment and need from a place of deficiency. It can also be incredibly beautiful. It can also be a tantric pathway to God and to realization. But it seems that it's something that isn't spoken about enough or barely at all in spiritual circles. And it can be very much taboo or suppressed, or in the other extreme, maybe quite hedonistic.
Yeah,
How
beautiful.
do you view that?
You framed it beautifully. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. How do we find the balance? And how does it relate to the topics we've been discussing?
Well, I think the first thing you suggested is it needs to be acknowledged, unacknowledged sexuality. We need to acknowledge it. I mean, I'm still amazed. I'm in my 70s and it's not like I'm attracted to every woman I meet, but wow, there is a strong, sexual energy. Sometimes it's really strong. Most of the time it's kind of in the background, but when it comes up, it's like, whoa, I forgot about that. That's really strong. It's such a, and when you're young, I remember when I was in my 30s, it was like a major preoccupation, right? Finding a mate, being with a woman, all of that is a very strong energy. And of course, Eros isn't only sexual, as you say. Eros is life force, life energy. According to Freud, I think Jung agrees pretty much with that. So Eros is the life energy, that springs forth from us, that draws us into the world. I actually love that book by Mingyur Rinpoche, In Love with the World. Here he is, a celibate monk who writes this beautiful book called In Love with the World, about his own journey, entering into the world, acknowledging Eros, in love with the world. So, Eros is there for everyone, even, a celibate monk. It's an active force. It's what keeps us alive. It's what keeps us living. It's what keeps us engaged with life. All of that. That's all Eros, right? But Eros in its sexual expression is really, I would say, suppressed in certain traditions, actively suppressed. Theravada Buddhist tradition, actively suppressed, and otherwise unacknowledged, and unspoken about. I mean, when do you ever hear so-called spiritual people talking about how strong that sexual attraction is and how to work with that? Yeah. The Buddha, when he did his original investigations, for him, he used the word tanha, which means thirst. He talks about desire. The word he used was tanha, thirst. Thirst primarily means sexual desire. Mm-hmm. The Buddha was working with his sexual energy. Remember all the dancing girls in the myths? This was a very sexual man, right? Yeah. He was working with very strong sexual energies. Little Buddha, that film where you see the dancing girls and so for him, I think particularly, sex was a big deal. And I think that's one of the reasons why in the early Sangha, they kind of cut it out of the picture, So it's interesting how that evolved. But there really isn't much, what do you do with it? After all, what do you do with it? Sexual energy. You either act it out, or you suppress it, or you sublimate it. Right, that's the usual ways of talking about it, into your creativity or your work or, your family relationships or whatever. You sublimate it, but it's a strong current, not for everyone, but for many, if not most people, right? So we need to acknowledge that. And so I really wanted to talk about it in its many guises, both sexual and all the other guises. And so what I did in the book is I tried to, or I did, divide love into upper chakras, the higher and lower octaves of love. Mm-hmm. And what I said very importantly, what I emphasized was that higher and lower doesn't mean better or worse. It's like in a composition of music. You don't think the higher notes are better than the lower notes, do you? And yet the energies higher up in the body are somehow better, more spiritually superior than those lower in the body. Why? Why is that the case? Because they're more difficult to deal with. Okay. And because, as you say, awakening takes much longer to get down into the lower chakras and to penetrate that realm of our experience, So I think that's the issue with Eros is it's denigrated, and dismissed. And I think we need to bring it into the conversation. And this is where Non-dual means nothing left out, comes in, where tantric approaches. I really align much more with a tantric view than I do with the Advaita view. I have to say, I never consider myself a teacher of Advaita Vedanta. Zen is a very strong tantric component. Tibetan Buddhism, of course, very strong tantric component. Jean Klein, my teacher, was also a student of Kashmir Shaivism when he was in India. So all of my teachers have always embraced all of it, thank goodness. So I think some of the non-dual traditions are rejecting of the sexual. I think Advaita is definitely one of them, by and large. And we see Advaita teachers acting out all over. So, I think we need to embrace it. We need to acknowledge it. We have to acknowledge that it's difficult for us to deal with. What do we do with it? You're probably in your 30s. It's a lot harder for you than it is for me. But when I was in my 30s, forget it. I was already married, but then I got married again. That was my way of, I ended up getting married, one way to deal with it. You have a partner you can be sexual with. But so, I think you just need to acknowledge it. You need to embrace it, realize it's an issue, and see where it goes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. It is it's important, but the more I hear you talk, the more important it becomes. And I want to know, I'm bringing together a few themes, and I'm not going to mention this teacher in particular, but it's also an archetype in that, and you talk about Advaita speak or Dharma logic, this idea of appropriating spiritual concepts in a way that almost fuels other ulterior
we know
motives.
Who we're talking about, yeah.
Exactly. And there's always controversies, but there's one modern day teacher at the moment who there's a lot of stuff surfacing around abuse and sexual misrelating. And he would, in terms of not acknowledging sexuality, the lengths that he would go to use all this high level spiritual language rather than be direct and say, I'm attracted to you and I want to have sex with you, created all sorts of mental house of mirrors and deception, gaslighting, because there clearly in that person was an unacknowledgement of that drive. And
exactly,
you see that, right? The spiritual ego, just be honest. If you're man or woman, whatever situation, whatever sexuality, if it's there, I think it has to be acknowledged of, oh, this could be driving me right now, especially in a leadership position, even almost like there's more responsibility. So that's my mini rant. I also wanted to know how beautiful this description of the octaves is. And, it makes me, and I'm kind of thinking this through in the moment, so I don't know how accurate it will come across, but the difference between Eros and sexual energy, where it feels like the heart chakra is also open. Like you mentioned this monk and being in love with life. And James Hillman talks to this as well. This idea of being in love versus suppression is almost like the heart and below is closed. Whereas lust is like the lower chakras are running the show, and that there's like a blockage. And I wonder if Tantra is that bringing mind, heart, and
absolutely
sexuality, right?
I'm not an expert on Tantra. I am going to interview for my podcast Christopher Wallace Harish on Shiva. What is it? Shiva non-dual Tantra, Shaivite non-dual Tantra, and we'll find out more from his point of view. Yeah. But I think it's what does traditional Tantra say about that?
Yeah, and especially, and I don't want to overshare, but having. The reason I'm exploring this, I was in a long-term relationship. I was in a 7-year relationship, and that I broke up with my partner not so long ago, or long enough, but long enough to try and process it, but to ask the question that you ask, which is what to do with this, because compared to when I was in my 20s, I have a different set of values. I want to act in integrity, so I don't want to act out on that, and yet the energy's there. So I think it is a question of, like you mentioned, directing that in different ways in life, but fundamentally acknowledging it. Because I know for me, if I'm suppressing that energy, I'm suppressing my vitality in all areas of life.
Exactly.
Right?
I think that's Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you said about telling the truth is the essential key ingredient here. I always say, we talk about truth, and in these non-dual traditions, we talk about the essential truth of reality and life. But if we're going to talk about truth, we need to, embrace truth at every level. We need to tell the truth at every level. If you're not telling the truth at every level, you're not living in integrity, and you're not aligning yourself with what you're teaching, which is that the most important thing is the truth. Okay, truth at every level. Tell the truth. It's hard to tell the truth. It's hard to know the truth. Acknowledge, totally. But that's part of your responsibility. Find it out and express it.
Yeah, I love that. I feel we're in a really good place to possibly bring this to a close. I'm wondering if there's anything else as an extension of that, a kind of closing remarks, closing thoughts around the theme of infinite awakening. What would be a takeaway or a pointer that you would like to leave?
Well, one thing is I'd like to say is that, because it is the pathless path, and because you are the path and you are following your own path, don't compare yourself with others. I think there's a kind of a cult of Ramana Maharshi, and others in that vein, who are the renunciates, who spent their whole life devoted to truth, whose only love object is their mother and their cow. We don't, who didn't have intimate relationships with other people. He was friendly with the people in the ashram. But, we are dealing with a whole nother dimension. We're doing something that hasn't really been done historically. There have been lay awakened people in the different lineages, but mostly they've been monastics, ashram residents, renunciates, etc., who've done this, and we're doing something unique. And I point that out throughout the book. We're trying to integrate the absolute and the relative. We're trying to live as ordinary human beings, as people in the world, loving and being loved and making mistakes and, fumbling all over the place and failing and succeeding. And that whole, what used to be called samsara, and sometimes is called samsara. Of course, samsara is a point of view. It's not the reality. But, how do you engage in that without turning it into samsara, so that it isn't, about attachment to the gain and loss, but about freedom within those parameters, those realms? How do you do that? I think that's really new, unique. And we're engaged in something really exploratory. We're pioneers. And so I think to acknowledge and honor yourself, the most important thing in all this, love yourself, honor yourself, compassion for yourself. It's quite a steep climb. It's quite a journey that we're on in this non-dual direct approach, journey that many of us are sharing. So really love yourself, be kind to yourself. Don't compare yourself with others. Really appreciate your own beautiful flower that you are.
Beautifully said, Stephan. I highly recommend your book to everyone tuning in. And I am just personally so grateful for today's conversation. And I think it's hard, and to whatever degree I create, I think it's hard to know the impact that you have on people. But you've had such a positive impact on my awakening in ways I probably don't even understand. So I feel really privileged to get to speak with you about such meaningful topics. And thanks so much for thinking of me to discuss this with. And I hope we have more conversations.
It's a great conversation. I'll do it again tomorrow if you like. Yeah, it's been lovely. Too. You ask great questions and you have your own very well-considered input and wisdom to share. So I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.